Sure. Thank you. Again, my name is Alisa Cupid. It's a pleasure to be here on this important issue. I am the program director of the Allen Women's Resource Center, which is an emergency domestic violence and intimate partner violence shelter. We provide shelters for families. So usually it's women and children. And though our name is Allen Women's Resource Center, we do also provide services to men, all genders, as we do not discriminate. So it's just important that we that I mention that, because often we tend to forget that domestic violence affects all and not just women. So I wanted to point that out. So as an emergency shelter, most of our families reside with us for 180 days. We're a communal setting. And it's hoped that within the 180 days that our families would find permanent housing, but too often, that is not the case. Too often what our families do is they end up going to a tier 2 shelter, which they can sometimes stay at for up to 2 years while they try to get back on their feet. And I just want to make this distinction, which I didn't make in the last workshop. As I mentioned that we're a DV shelter, often what happens is we have families that need to go to a shelter. And sometimes what they do is they go into the shelter system, usually it's the PATH system in the Bronx. But if it's a domestic violence situation that is bringing them to the shelter, it's important that families make that known, because once that's known, then the counselors will work to make sure that that person is sent to a domestic violence shelter that would have services that's more focused on the trauma and the crises in which they're coming out of. So that's the work that we do. Thank you.
Thanks. Joe? Joe, can you hear me?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I can hear you. I should introduce myself. I'm sorry. My name is Joe. I work at Vocal New York. I'm the housing campaigns coordinator. And yes, Vocal is a 20-year-old nonprofit. Our services are split. Half is direct service for folks who are active drug users, based around harm reduction, so getting clean works, Narcan training, naloxone training, stuff like that. And then the other half is, community organizing around 4 issue areas. So, we organize with folks who are actively using drugs to end the drug war and mass incarceration. And the drug war and overdose. We have a civil rights union that's concerned with ending mass incarceration. And we have a positive leaders union that is attempting to end the HIV and AIDS crisis. And then I work for the homelessness union that's working on, issues around housing access and, increasing the supply for affordable housing in New York. So yeah, we're really happy to be here, and yeah, that's what we do.
Thank you. Reverend Terry?
Hi, my name is Terry. I work for Project Hospitality in Staten Island. We're a 40-year-old interfaith effort serving the needs of homeless and hungry people in our borough. We do a continuum of care that begins with street outreach, food, clothing, shelter, food pantries, soup kitchens, 24-hour drop-in center, both for homeless people and for homeless youth, and church-based shelters throughout Staten Island, as well as services such as mental health, substance abuse, medical care, HIV services, legal services, and immigrant services. And we are now in the process of building a permanent, affordable, and supportive housing in our borough. And that's who we are.
Thank you. I think I would like to do what I want to do is just ask a question for all 3 of you. And then after we answer them, maybe Reverend Troia, you can walk us through the really fantastic sort of examples that you have. So my initial question for all of you is, how can faith communities help develop accessible and affordable community housing for vulnerable populations? It's a big question, it's a loaded question, but it's an important one. Feel free to jump in, whoever feels like they want to answer first, and then we'll go to Reverend Terry, and then she can do her slideshow showing them.
Well, I can jump in first and just say that it begins with passion for a community and for people in need. So what is most helpful, especially if we're talking about vulnerable populations, is for your congregation or your center to know who you want to care for and who you're willing to go to the wall for. Because it is a difficult process that it's not always accepted in communities, and you'll have pushback, and you need to really be strong and clear in your commitment and in your mission to serve and to build and to make housing possible. And there's a whole range of housing, from emergency shelter and stabilization beds to transitional housing to permanent housing, both supportive housing and affordable housing and mixed housing. And then when you've decided that that's what you want to do with your piece of property or your building, then you need to really talk to people, like at the Interfaith Center and at other places where you can get the technical assistance to put together the financial package that you need to actually do the construction or the renovation, to learn what state and city agencies have funding, capital funding for projects like this. And then, because you're serving a vulnerable population, we call that supportive housing, and you're going to need to get some kind of supportive services to go along with that housing. And those are also a myriad group of city and state and federal agencies that provide that level of care that would allow you to have 24-hour staffing and the right kind of services that allow the people that you welcome into your home to have the highest quality of life.
Thank you. Reverend Alisa, Joe?
Yeah, I think it's once you decide what it is that you want to do, I always like that Reverend Terry starts with passion, and you figuring out that this is a population that you have to serve, then you need to find out where your funding is going to be coming from, what programs that there are to assist you out there. As a domestic violence shelter, we do work with the city, with HRA that helps us in the funding to provide our services and keep our doors open daily. But then it's also being educated or having to network to find out what other grants there are out there, whether it's grants from the city, the state, also being in close contact. It's extremely important that you maintain close contact with community boards in the area, with the local council members, and just being in constant communication with them, because it's that communication that helps you to learn what discretionary funds are out there that will help to fund your program. And we have applied for those and have gotten those type of discretionary funding, as well as grant funding from state and federal sources.
Thank you. Joe, did you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what Folks Excited really covers a lot of what I would say. I mean, I guess I just think that there's a real need right now for a very vocal support from the New York City community to programs, that serve vulnerable populations. And I think that there's, a narrative that exists amongst elected officials that, like, certain communities in certain parts of the city don't want these programs. They don't want these people living in those communities. And I don't think that that's true, but I think that we need, more vocal support from those folks.
Thank you. Reverend Terry, would you like to go walk through some of the examples that Project Hospitality has built and done for vulnerable populations on Staten Island?
Sure. So, hey, Andrew, we're on. Okay, so these are just some examples of all different kinds of housing we've done on Staten Island. Next slide. So we're going to start here. This is the project that we're about to begin. We just purchased, literally less than 2 weeks ago, closed on this building that had a major fire. And we are going to be rehabbing it and making it into 10 apartments for supportive housing for people living with HIV, for homeless people living with HIV, mental illness, and substance use. So it's a triply diagnosed population. This is a 16-unit building that we built in 2017, 5 years ago. It's 16 studio apartments for homeless people living with HIV and mental illness and or substance use. So again, dual or triply diagnosed population. So they're all disabled. You can flip a couple more slides. You might be able to. Okay, this we just opened in November. This is 48 units of studio housing. 2/3 of it is supportive housing for homeless people from the special populations of chronic homelessness with substance use or mental health or physical disability or developmental disability, whatever, some level of disability. And 1/3 of the apartments went by lottery through HPD Housing Connect for people in the community. It's a magnificent merger of affordable and supportive housing with 24-hour-a-day service, security, case management, 7 days a week, 9 to 5. And actually a service center will be on the first floor so people can get all sorts of entitlements and can actually have food pantry within the house themselves. Next. Okay, this was our very first faith-based project at Immaculate Conception Church in Stapleton, Staten Island. This is their convent. We took over the basement of the convent in 1984 to open the first homeless shelter on Staten Island. We were in the basement for 10 years. We got the funding together from the New York State Office of Mental Health and from HUD to build transitional housing for people with mental illness and chemical addiction, what's called the dually diagnosed residents. We have 23 people living in this residence. Again, we converted it from a convent. Next slide. This is our dining room, and it looks just like the convent dining room looked like. Next slide. These are, the next 2 slides are of our kitchen. We worked very hard to be sure that everything was metal and not wood. Thank you. Next slide. This is our laundry room, which was the confessional. At the time that it was a convent, we kept it the dirty laundry room. That's a joke. Sorry. Next. This was the chapel. We converted the chapel into a living room. Next. And this is one of the bedrooms. This is somebody's home, small. It's got a little bathroom built into it, and basically a bed and a desk and a television set. Next. We don't have any elevators, so we have stairs, 3 floors of stairs. We handicap rooms are on the first floor. This was the nuns' TV room. It's still the TV room minus the nuns. Next. We have one on each floor. We were able to build a deck. The deck comes off the 2nd floor. These are just some pictures of the deck. Behind the deck on the right-hand side is the school affiliated with the church. One more slide. And this are the founders of this residence called O'Callahan House for Mac and Pierce O'Callahan, who were members of this congregation who served the first meal in the shelter in 1984. And we named the building in their memory. Next. Okay, keep going. That's the 16-unit building I had just talked about. All right, this is a 30-unit building that we built across the street from a church, 2 churches that we had a relationship with. So it wasn't church property. It was actually a chemical corporation. And this is called a safe haven for chronic homeless people. Almost everybody in this residence also suffers from one of the vulnerability indexes, which would be mental health or substance use or a combination thereof. Next. This opened in 2008, by the way. We're across the street from Mount Sinai Community Enrichment Center. This pastor was the only person in the community that stood up to say that we needed this safe haven transitional residence in their community. So we thank him for that. We offered to expand and take over some of his building and give him some rent money, but he went with a hospital center instead. Next. That's the front of the building. And this is Jesus is the Answer Church, which also happens to be the site of the very first synagogue in Staten Island history. We had a shelter here for over 10 years, and we had hoped to do housing on the 1st and 2nd floor. But by the time we got into ready to do that, the congregation folded, the pastor died. And once the congregation is gone, it's really hard to do faith-based housing. Instead, it's now become a storage unit for a restaurant. Quite shameful that it went that way. Next. This is the parsonage of First Presbyterian Church in Stapleton, Staten Island. We opened here a transitional residence for 11 or 12 homeless people living with addiction. And the next slide will show you how close we are actually to the sanctuary. There's the parsonage and there's the sanctuary. This was called Neighborhood Homes. We were here for 5 years. Next. This is Stapleton UAME Church. In the basement of the church underneath those stairs is where we opened up a shelter for undocumented immigrants with substance use issues in January of 2020, just prior to the pandemic. Next. This is another view of the church. It's also a major food pantry in the community. Next. This is inside the church. The church hall is both a soup kitchen and a food pantry. And where you see the shopping cart, that's where we would put 2 or 3 beds, cots open up on this side, and then another slide, please. That's the center, which gave us access to the kitchen and to the bathrooms, and that's the other side. So we had 4 to 5 beds here lined up on either side of the soup kitchen tables. We were here for 2 years. Next. I think that's it. Okay, so those are examples of all different kinds of housing.
Great, thank you. Actually, Reverend Terry, somebody asked you a question in the chat, which was, can you say more about how your organization overcomes NIMBY? And yes, can you answer that first before we jump into the second half of that?
Well, I'm not sure we've actually overcome NIMBY. And if anybody else has, I'd like to know the formula for success. But I will say that it's very hard. It's very hard. And we lived through some really, really horrible, sick stuff that happened in the communities. So I think you have to find a community that kind of welcomes you. And a lot of times in the poorer communities, you're more welcomed because people see it as an asset to the community. And also people see the need because they see the people that are homeless on the streets, and they see the people lined up at the soup kitchen line and in the food pantry line. So that tends to be the easier community to go into because they recognize the need for the service and they see it as a lift to the community. But what worries me is when we do that, we're not really sharing the burden across all of the communities. And I think that the biggest issue we really struggle with is racism, in particular on Staten Island. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but we find that 2/3 of Staten Island is predominantly white. The South Shore of Staten Island is 2% people of color, and that's people of every color. So it makes it really hard to put programs in the community because people think you're changing the racial balance of my neighborhood, which is not necessarily true and wouldn't be a bad idea if it were true. But I have seen some really, really ferocious, fierce, and violent acts of resistance. And you want people to be safe. You don't want people to face resistance once they move in and the hatred of neighbors. So it's very, very hard to do. But coalition building is the best thing you can do, is getting people on your side in favor of what you're doing and passionately supporting what you're doing and serving people.
Thank you. I guess as we're all 3 of you were speaking, and I just wanted to let people know, and then maybe you guys can each delve into this a little bit. You've spoken about it, but I want you to talk about it just a little bit more. Who are the different vulnerable populations that each of your organizations sort of focuses on and works with? And how can we help build bridges as faith leaders and faith communities with those vulnerable populations?
I mean, I can. So I think, look, I think the biggest, most vulnerable population that we work with that is relatively unique is folks who are active drug users. And I think that like one perspective that I would just bring, is I think one of the things that Focal has done really successfully over the years is just tried things and see what worked, and a lot of things worked in surprising ways. And one of them was really doing, high quality political community organizing with folks who are in this kind of crisis. And I think often it's sort of viewed as impossible that folks who are deep in crisis can't really engage with the political process. They can't really, be taken to lobby or educated on bills and legislation. And I think the exact opposite can be true, and I think that folks who are in a really life and death situation, which many of the people we work with are the ones that we can really engage with and get to speak a lot of truth to power about what the public policy that we have in the city really does to folks. So I think that's critical if we want to get out of this. And I think I second what Terry was saying about NIMBYism. I think it's a really horrible thing, but one thing that I will say is that, I think we need to get more organized on our end, of the folks who are actually on the ground, in these really tricky situations, and getting them involved in the political process, because it's just not true, that the 200,000 people who are, approximately, who are homeless in the city are any less politically valuable than anybody else, right? They're citizens, they vote, they have all the political power that anybody else does, and we need to leverage that better against the people who are racist and want to prevent the things from coming in their neighborhood. And I say that as a lifelong resident of Bay Ridge, which is Staten Island's sister community that is also extremely racist and really, really reluctant to have these kinds of programs in our community. But we can be leveraged against successfully.
Right. So the population that we work with at Allen Women's Resource Center are survivors of domestic violence. The statistics show, and not to go too much into stats, but 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men are victims of some sort of domestic violence. In addition, it's known that every 20 minutes that someone, undergoes some sort of physical abuse. So even as we're having this conversation right now, unfortunately, someone is in danger, or some bodies are in danger. So we are like a crisis center. We're a place where people come in the midst of trauma. Too often the question is asked, well, why doesn't someone just leave? And it's not a matter of just leaving. It's not easy. There's such a myriad number of reasons, whether it's for the kids, whether it's financial, but housing is also a huge issue and a huge reason, especially if you were living with someone and you guys codependent and supporting the household, or perhaps you weren't working. The idea of even being able to move out, domestic violence and intimate partner violence is not something that happens to one race, one ethnicity, one socioeconomic class. It impacts everyone. However, the outcome and the way someone could address or deal with it differs based on, unfortunately, based on a race, based on, socioeconomic situation. Not everyone could just go and sign a new lease or go to a hotel. They need somewhere to go and somewhere to go quickly. And that's what we're here for. What's different with us is, I know the speakers before me, they mentioned NIMBY. That doesn't seem, I don't think that's much of an issue that we face, because we're confidential setting, right? So the whole idea with a domestic violence shelter is no one is supposed to know of our existence in the community or the neighborhood. We try to, keep it confidential as much as we can. So usually the neighbors would not know that there's a shelter across the street. Sometimes, next door, they'll get ideas because the population changes pretty much on anywhere from 2 to 6 months. You see different faces, different children, and so forth. But we're pretty much hidden. In terms of building bridges with the community and for affordable housing, I think that it's about education is one way that we build bridges. A lot of community outreach on domestic violence through the congregations. We go to local colleges. Just the other day I was doing a community outreach at a gym called me in to do a community outreach on domestic violence. So I feel that when we're voicing these things in the community, it's helping the awareness of the community, and it's also building an empathy and a compassion that makes the community want to embrace certain types of service and welcome them in. So I think that's one way of building bridges. The other way of building bridges, as I mentioned earlier, is staying in contact with our community boards and our local representatives in what's going on and what our needs are and what we see as the needs of a community, and affordable housing is at the top of that list.
Thank you. Reverend Terry, would you like to?
Sure. So this is what I want to share about special populations. First, I just want to say that anybody who is vulnerable, anybody who is homeless is vulnerable, regardless of whether they have the title of a vulnerable population or vulnerable community. That's the first thing I think you need to know. Secondly, It can be any kind of vulnerability. It could be a medical vulnerability, behavioral health condition. It can be your inability to access services because of your social location. And I don't mean what street you live on. I mean where you are in the pecking order of the social strata. And for example, we are doing transitional housing for undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants, especially if they don't have identification, are they don't access medical insurance, public medical insurance, which affects their ability to handle chronic conditions, including substance use issues, or including medical issues or mental health issues. It could be rejection from social support that places you in a bad social location. For example, lack of social support due to gender or sexuality-based differences. The family rejection of youth who are LGBTQIA, GNC, for example. And we do youth housing. I didn't bring any examples of our youth housing because there would have been too many slides, but we have three youth transitional housing programs. I would say probably 60% of our youth are LGBTQ in the continuum. And we also have a 24-hour youth drop-in center. But family rejection of LGBTQ youth is a significant factor in the young people becoming homeless. Folks from vulnerable populations need special support. That might include medical services on site, mental health counseling, substance use counseling, life skills, helping a youth stay in school, helping anybody get skill-based training for self-sufficiency, such as financial management, helping with pre-job or pre-employment skills, job training itself, and job placement. It's likely that you'll need 24-hour staff, and whether it's regulated or not, if you have a building and you're in charge of that building, or that building's on your property, or you own that building, you're responsible for what happens there 24 hours a day. And there could be any kind of a crisis at night. We've had people take heart attacks in the middle of the night. We've had people set fire in the middle of the night. We've had people have emotional crises in the middle of the night, blackout, heat turning off. It's always good to figure out a way, whether it's a volunteer from the church or it's a paid staff person, to have somebody on site. Vulnerable populations are also perceived as a burden, and that's a misconception, and that's wrong. Actually, in our weakness, God is strong. But that kind of a misconception leads to the suspicion that breeds bad community relations and the NIMBY syndrome. People say, I don't want young kids living next to me, even though you got 8 kids in your family. I don't want drug addicts living next to me, even though we're overeating in the refrigerator. I don't want mentally ill people living next to me, even though I'm screaming all the time at my wife or my kids. I don't want drunks living next to me, and we've got a bar in our living room. I don't want people with AIDS living next to me because they might infect my children. I don't want those immigrants living next to me because they don't speak English and they're dirty and they're all drunks and they're always looking at my wife. I mean, these are the kind of things that people actually get up and say at public meetings. If you're going to offer housing to a vulnerable community, you need to be sure that you love that community as they are, who they are, and that you can welcome them as your own. This is not about making money. It's about making a way for people to come into your holy space and feel safe. That said, supported housing for vulnerable communities means that you need a contract for services and on-site staff above and beyond the bricks and mortar of building. So there are programs in the state and in the city. For example, New York, the 1515 housing, which provides a vulnerability index for people and qualifies them based on that vulnerability index for supportive services. Human Resources Administration, HACA, New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the New York State Office of Mental Health, the New York State Office of Alcohol Addiction and Substance Abuse Services, U.S. Housing and Urban Development HOPWA programs. All of these are programs that provide on-site 24-hour services through a contract. And you'll need technical assistance if you're going to take the next step to figure out what to do with your church building or your piece of property, to be sure that your housing is hooked up to the supported housing wraparound services and resources. Supportive housing is a housing first model, which means that you accept and take that person in regardless of what vulnerabilities they carry on their backs or inside their hearts. That means that you accept the person where they are at, and that your goal is not to change them, but to create the space where change can take place. And you need to know that before they desire to enter your program, you have that commitment to them so that they do enter your program. Well, you will face that community opposition. It's a fact of life, and you can prepare for that but you have to plow your way through community opposition. You can't dance around it. There's a lot of prep work that needs to be done before you announce to a community what you're thinking. You need to connect with allies in the community. You need to do and participate in community education years and years before you do in any building, bricks and mortar. And you need to build a coalition to prepare people that have a stake inside this program coming to fruition to actually stand with you throughout the process. I hope that's helpful information.
I think it was very helpful, actually, and you sort of answered our second question, and the next question, and I'm asking Reverend Alisa and Joel if you guys want to take a stab at this question. Hadim asked in the chat, what are the best methods to overcome barriers in your outreach efforts within the work that you're doing? For those that are here, you guys, we have about another 10 more minutes, and then we have to go back to the main space for closing. But if anyone has any questions, please come off of mute, ask your question, or put them in the chat. So again, what are some of the best methods to overcome barriers in your outreach efforts?
I think overcoming barriers is really being a presence in the community. One of the things, so let me just go back a little, because one of the things I probably didn't mention or make clear. So I'm with Allen Women's Resource Center, a domestic violence shelter. This domestic violence shelter was founded by the Greater Allen AME Cathedral of New York. More specifically, it was founded by the Fannie Lou Hamer Missionary Society under the Reverend Floyd H. Flake, who's now Pastor Emeritus, and Reverend Elaine Flake, who's now pastor of the church. The presence in the community of that church has been very strong for decades. Allen Women's Resource Center has been around for over 30 years. So the one thing that I recall, I've always heard pastors say, is that people tend to go where their needs are being met. Right. And when I say being a presence in the community, it doesn't mean just being a church on a corner or wherever, and you have your congregations coming and then they leave and they go back to their homes, whether it might be outside the community. But what are you doing for the community? How are you engaging the community? How are you interacting with the community? So once the community sees that you're a presence, that you care about the community, that you care about developing the community, I think that's one way that you get some buy-in on some of the programs. And that's one way that you get to overcome some of the barriers to outreach efforts that you're mentioning. So for instance, in this particular case, we have Allen Nonprofits, we have Allen Women's Resource Center. The nonprofits right now runs 5 senior centers. We also have the senior housing, we have the affordable homes, the affordable rentals. So with all of this investment, and then in addition to that, it's just pouring back out into the community, offering workshops, first-time home buyers workshops, tenants' rights workshops, mortgage workshops, job fairs, immigration. All of these put the churches or the faith institutions' name into the community, that the community realizes that this is an institution that's investing back into the community, and they become trusted in the community. And once that trust is built, then certain other programs that you may want to introduce in the community may be more welcomed, or they may be more open to, because you have a trusted investment in the community. They identify with you. They know that you try to do something good. So I would say that's one way, or some ways of overcoming the barriers.
I think that we do outreach, like when we say outreach, we mean a sort of different thing. We don't do a ton of outreach for our direct services because we're a storefront drop-in center. There are folks who work for us who go out and do harm reduction work out on the street. I'm not heavily involved in that work, and so I don't really want to speak on it. We do a lot of political outreach with folks who are very vulnerable about joining, the political work that we're doing, which is always an evolving thing. I think we're always coming up with different techniques that we try to use to get folks more engaged on that stuff. But I don't think that that's the kind of outreach we're being asked about.
Great. Does anyone have any questions in the chat or in the audience participants? Do you have any particular questions? I think we might have lost Reverend Terry, but I'm sure we'll get her back. There's a really great question in the chat. It's the city and state do not offer housing voucher to undocumented folks at the moment. How can we do more to provide help to meet their needs?
Yeah, I'd love to speak on this. So the city, I want to say that first of all, the reason that the city funds voucher is not available to undocumented folks, as far as we know, is really just a choice. There's no law that prevents them from opening it up to folks who are undocumented. It's sort of an interpretation of a policy that DHS likes to claim as a law, but really I think they just don't want to spend the money to do it. I think from Vocal's standpoint, we have called on the city to do this. We released an op-ed, a couple of days ago with the Immigration Coalition, or maybe it's still being shopped and was not ever placed. But if you see an op-ed, we did that with New York Immigration Coalition, to sort of push the city council on this. We do think that they have the power to act. I also think it's important to recognize that, the federal government throws a lot of money at this problem. The city throws a lot of money at this problem. The state has not. And it's really just one of the worst actors in terms of not making any real investments in permanent solutions to the housing crisis. So we've called on the state a number of times to pass the Housing Access Voucher Program, which would be the most inclusive voucher program of its kind. And it would certainly include folks who are undocumented, folks who have prior felony convictions, and folks who have zero income, which are not, all three are not covered by Section 8 or local programs right now. So you're 100% right. I think that there was more attention being paid to this about 2-3 months ago when we were at the height of the sort of migrant busing crisis that was going on. But all of those folks many of them will become undocumented. And, if they are still homeless at that point, it'll be very, very difficult for them to access any sort of public service unless, law and policymakers change that on a level.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's much more I can add to that. It's just it's an unfortunate reality that we must continue to advocate on. We also try to do advocacy work with the New York Coalition Against Domestic Violence on issues like this. Is not only as it pertains to housing vouchers, but even recently the state issued a grant in which they were giving survivors funds to help with food, clothing, emergency needs. But the one thing, the exception was, you cannot offer these funds to undocumented individuals. And it was ridiculous. And we had so many people applying, and the idea that, we had to turn down applications because the state would not fund it, was something that was very disappointing and disheartening. So it's just a continued advocacy on that front.
Great. I guess with our final question, I would love if you both could answer, how can faith-based communities get involved in the work that you're doing?
I think in getting involved in some of the work that we do, it's going to be involved maybe partnerships, but just partnerships on some of even the things, the smaller things that we do, like the education and getting more of communities and congregants and members of different organizations to participate in those educational programs, to participate in education about renters' rights and special programs that come out. Like we had ERAP that came out during COVID, right? And also getting involved in it, and I think Joe will speak about more, the advocacy piece, right? Getting churches involved in advocacy. And then I mentioned education before. I really believe educating the community is a really, really big piece, and going beyond the four walls of your faith institution, not necessarily waiting for people to come in, but finding the different and various ways that you can go out, whether it's at pantries, in conjunction with the food pantries, having events that will provide knowledge and educate the community, having summer fairs at the park, hosting job fairs. These are all activities that we have participated in. to help do the work. So if other faith-based community organizations would like to partner up in doing that, that's something that can definitely be done. I don't think that, I think that's very important that we remember that we're not operating in a silo here. We're all working towards a common goal. And I think sometimes too often, we kind of like stay in our individual corners with our individual members and congregations instead of coming together and figuring out how we can do this on a greater level.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely second everything that was just said. I think that that was really, really well put. And I think, I mean, to speak to the advocacy side of things for a minute, I guess I will say that, like, it would be wildly effective. I said this on the last panel, and I feel like I answered this question really well on the last panel, and now I'm not going to be able to answer it as well. And I have COVID right now, so my brain's a little bit foggy. But yeah, I mean, if Vocal could get a bus full of faith leaders up to Albany to talk to elected officials, it would be wildly effective. And I think, one of the things that I think we would love to see is like just a greater sense of solidarity, and in the same way that Ms. Cupid has been talking about, faith leaders singing outside of the four walls of their church, right? Like, recognizing that, like, the gentrification that threatens New York communities, that Vocal cares about, are also fundamental, threats to faith institutions, right? And the ability, particularly for small churches, and other faith institutions that cater to immigrant communities of color, the communities that are really at risk of rampant gentrification. They need tenant protections. They need rental assistance in order to survive in the long run. And the only institutions that have the ability to provide those kinds of things are the government. And so, like, there's a real need to get, deeply involved into movements like House Straw that's being put in the chat. I think this year in Albany is going to be critical, just in the sense that if you just are looking about housing and thinking about housing, I think that, for the first time in a long time, the government on a state level is going to acknowledge that there is a housing crisis. I think the state of the state is going to focus on the plan to deal with housing in the state of New York. And I think that a lot of the policies in that plan are going to be, the same kinds of policies that got us into this mess in the first place. And so I think there's going to be a real need for, people who are seen as community leaders who have, a sort of objection. We're not viewed as objective. Vocal is not viewed as objective. Vocal is viewed as people who are kind of crazy and will do whatever they want to get stuff for their members. And so people who are seen as more speaking for, holistically for communities is going to be this year.
I'm just going to announce that the rooms will be closing in a couple of seconds, and and bring everyone back to the main space. So I want to thank Reverend Alisa, Joel, Reverend Terry, who jumped off a little early before, but thank you so much for educating us and sharing your experience and knowledge within the work that you're doing in helping vulnerable populations get affordable housing and what that looks like within our communities. So thank you.